Welcome back to the Stimulating Stuff podcast. I'm your host, Rich Vogel, and I want to wish you a happy 4th of July. It has been 249 years since the Second Continental Congress convened in my home city of Philadelphia and declared independence from England, which means that next year is our semi-quincentennial, or our 250th anniversary, semi-quincentennial. Kudos to you if you can say it and spell it. Today, I am talking about or addressing some online comments about the emerging crisis in neuromonitoring that I reviewed in my last episode. Before I go on, I want to let you know a few things, some important announcements related to this podcast. So first, I transitioned this entire podcast over to a new server, which means that I had to rebuild the whole thing from the ground up. So even if you have liked it, followed it, subscribed to it in the past, you actually need to go back and do it again. So if you're listening to this right now, no matter what platform you're on, if you wouldn't mind just scrolling up and hitting the follow or subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. I'm now obviously recording, if you're watching this, I'm recording this in video. So it's best to subscribe on Spotify and YouTube because they're the only two podcasting platforms presently that actually allow for video recording and video distribution. Otherwise, everything is in audio, and sometimes I'll be showing graphs or wearing funny shirts. Either way, you'll probably want to see it. So Spotify and YouTube are the two video outlets. Everything else you'll have audio only. Also, I set up a new subreddit. It's the Rich Vogel subreddit, and you can go there to post your questions or comments, and you can also feel free to continue emailing me at stimulatingstuffpodcast@gmail.com. Of course, you can also post your questions and comments on Spotify and YouTube, and I'll always keep your questions and comments anonymous unless you give me permission to disclose, or if your social media handle already discloses your name by virtue of the handle, and it's in a public forum. That way I don't really have a choice because you've already disclosed it, right? Okay, so let's jump into this. In my last episode, I shared data that showed that neuromonitoring is basically in trouble. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are some challenges ahead. And if you haven't seen the episode in video format, I strongly suggest that you go back and check it out on YouTube or Spotify. But basically, one of the things that I said in that episode is that the number of neuromonitoring cases continues to rise, and the number of active CNIMs is not rising. And if you want to keep up with demand, we need to nearly double our workforce in the next 10 years. So today, July 4th, there are 4,274 active CNIMs. That doesn't include people who have expired. That doesn't include non-emeritus. And keep in mind that it took us 30 years to get to that number of active CNIMs because Abret founded the CNIM in 1996. Here we are in 2025. So it took us 30 years to get to 4,274 active CNIMs. And now we need to be well over 7,000 within 10 years. So, just keep that in mind. And, adding 3,000 net new CNIMs by 2035 is a significant challenge. And if things don't change soon, there is actually an inflection point coming in 2027 where we won't have enough CNIMs to meet the case demand, meaning patients at that point are going to start going without neuromonitoring, or current CNIMs are going to have to work to support more patients. So that means more work, more travel, etc. So, I didn't talk about neurologists in that last episode, but there are definitely less than 300 neurologists in the U.S. monitoring nearly 1 million patients. Fellowship programs are not churning out enough neurologists, which means that neurologists in the workforce today will need to double their concurrency over the next 10 years. Those are just the numbers. And that's another significant challenge, I think, that no one is really talking about. but I thought I would take this opportunity to review some of the feedback that I received on YouTube and address it on the show. So here is the first comment that I received. This comes from @Joe Hartman. He says, and I'm just going to read this here. It says, new CNIMs per year has been pretty flat at 220 to 250 per year. COVID and surprise billing most likely played a role in the recent years drop off in maintaining the CNIM. My guess is that we trend back up instead of continuing on the downward trend. That said, in my experience, there's a continued uptick in CNIM requirements by hospitals. The much harder estimates of non-CNIM providers would, in theory, be the group shrinking fastest, as they'd be forced to take the exam or forced out. Something to consider even if the trend does go back to flat. So I responded to that and I said, all great points. Thoughts on recruiting and retention challenges? I keep hearing about 20 to 25% attrition of inexperienced hires in the first year leaving the field. Can we double the CNIM workforce in 10 years? I haven't even gotten to the neurologist side, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to repeat it because I just said it to you guys. So @Joe Hartman responded and said, I would say the retention side is harder than the recruiting side. We've never been more connected and mobile than we currently are. Our workforce has an increasingly larger percentage of digital native clinicians who might have started at a moment in history in which home prices were no longer in our range. However, if somebody's got 25% attrition rate, they're in a different type of trouble. You can't turn over workforce every 4 years. I would say the goal for most companies is around 10%, with it harder to meet the goal 3 to 5 years ago and a little bit easier currently, but the pendulum is always swinging. So I don't fully understand what a lot of that means, but I think I get the general sense. So let me start by clarifying. I'm not talking about companies turning over their entire workforce in like 4 to 5 years. So I want to clarify that I said companies are experiencing a 20 to 25% attrition rate, and I was talking about new inexperienced hires. So if a company were to hire 100 college graduates in December of 2024, we can expect 20 to 25 of them to be gone by 2025 December. So that's in the first year. These are inexperienced hires. That's not a knock on neuromonitoring companies. The fact is that today's graduates just aren't staying in their jobs. When it comes to a specific job with a specific company, there's a major difference, and I'm just talking statistics here. There's a major difference between today's graduates and previous generations. So, for example, let's look at today's graduates. Today's graduates are the Gen Zers. They graduated from college between 2019 and 2025. Here's a stat. Over 55% of them have left their first job within the first year. So over half leave the first job within the first year. Nearly 70% depart within the first 2 years. And what's really interesting about this particular generation is that prior to entering the workforce and responding to surveys, they all say that they plan to stay with their first employer for about 7 years. So they value stability over and internal growth over jumping around. But nevertheless, 70% leave within the first 2 years, 50% leave within the first year, right? Okay, so how does that compare to other generations? Actually, before I get to that, I want to say that these data, I think, generally fit with the reports that I'm hearing from inside of neuromonitoring. And in fact, if you consider the fact that over 55% of recent graduates in this generation are leaving their first job, and the reports that I'm hearing from companies large and small, that there's a 20 to 25% attrition rate, one could argue that neuromonitoring is more stable than the overall marketplace. Okay, so let's talk about the previous generation. So if we go back 10 years to millennials, these are folks who graduated college between 2003 and 2015. Uh, Only 20% of them switch jobs in their first year, which is obviously much lower than the rate today. But what's really interesting is that when they entered the workforce, they said that they planned to stay with their first job. And I'm like 90% of them said they plan to stay at their first job less than 3 years, which was, going back 10, 15 years. That was a clear indicator that we're moving toward a transition of shorter tenures being a thing. If we go back 20 years to essentially my generation, Gen X, we graduated college in the 1990s up through about 2000. It was really common to stay with our first employer for many years. And baby boomers before that, they could stay with the same employer for 40 years or more. Now, I'm just guessing here, but maybe one thing that's different is that Gen Xers, like me, were somewhat impervious to perceived mistreatment. After all, if you think about it, we grew up as unsupervised latchkey kids who ate TV dinners, drank Tang mixed with water from the garden hose, and rode our bikes around without helmets and knee pads. Future generations had helicopter parents, bottled water, organic produce, and help with their homework. We didn't have these things. Mistreatment or perceived mistreatment is a totally foreign concept to Gen Zers. So I'm sure they're quick to ghost toxic workplaces like client hospitals that treat them like lowly vendors and or companies that are run by Gen Xers or worse, boomers who just expect a certain level of resilience for very little in return. I could be totally off base here, and I definitely don't believe in younger generation bashing. I'm just trying to find some answers in the chaos, I think. So, also, it's not just individual employers that younger generations are fleeing. When it comes to changing careers, and by that I mean moving into an entirely different profession, new college grads are definitely on the move too. So going back to the Gen Zers, these are people age, even Gen Z and millennial age 18 to 34. So 30% of them have completely changed fields since starting their first job out of college. 30%. So call it 1 in 3, call it 3 in 10, whatever. They're leaving their professions. And this is what I'm seeing in neuromonitoring too. Also, about 65% of those with 2 to 5 years of experience report that they're likely to change careers. They haven't done it yet, but 65% are likely to change in the next year or so. And 26% of people age 25 to 29 are actively seeking a career change right now. So they are definitely, I think it's unquestionable that young people today are exploring multiple professions within the first 5 years after college. And unfortunately, there isn't much data on previous generations, but based on what we already know about single employers, it seems to suggest that people tended in previous generations to stick with their field, their first chosen field. So I want to move now to another YouTube comment. This is from @LeaveLuckToHeaven. Comment says, "Hey, great episode. Missed the beard though. Thank you. I don't. It's hot. I like to have a clean shave in the summer." Anyway, this was really insightful, this person says. And at the end, I couldn't help but think of this as a microcosm of the issue we're seeing in all of neurodiagnostics. We have a projected need of about 27,000 net new neurodiagnostic by 2030, neurodiagnostic technologists by 2030. Back in 2019, it was about 1,100 new techs needed per year with only about 300 grads, right? Oh man. So now we're putting out approximately 450 new grads a year, and the need is much, much greater. This person says we're growing a deficit that is perfectly in line with the data that I found from scrubbing various websites, including Abret, and the overall progressive loss of CNIMs. So this person says, The question is, what do we do? How do we increase interest in this field? Not just to get new people to enter it, but to get hospitals and doctors to use us more and to keep existing techs from leaving. I banged my head against the wall with this for a while. It's going to take major concerted efforts. In the meantime, we can count on technology, innovative ideas, and underqualified, undertrained individuals to fill the gaps as the need grows. So here's my online reply to this comment. I said, I think one thing that could be done is to show some respect to technologists. The vendor model results in people being treated like shit. Let me say that again. The vendor model results in people being treated like shit. We all know the reasons. Licensure should happen for neurodiagnostic technologists, but the fact is physicians would never allow it. Okay, let me pause there on the comment that I was writing online and just explain why I believe that. So first, physicians in general don't want other clinicians eating their cake. Licensure opens the door for billing, and there's an aversion to letting non-physicians bill for services. This isn't just a neuromonitoring thing. I'm not just talking about neurologists. I don't want anybody to get butthurt here. I am talking about all physicians in all specialties. And it's an observation from many areas of medicine. The unfortunate consequence is that, most licensed clinicians end up working at the bottom of their license because they don't want to give up control. They could dedicate their work to more complex and advanced aspects of medicine, but they end up doing lesser work, quote unquote, because they don't want to give up the responsibility and let others bill insurance and collect money. So what happens? They get burned out. This is a major contributor to a number of issues that we have in healthcare today, and to the global healthcare crisis that we're experiencing in this country, in particular to physician and other clinician burnout. It's also a reason that getting licensure is such a challenge for unlicensed healthcare providers and practitioners, and there's very little optimism about changing this. If you want to know more about the challenges of licensure, I highly recommend a podcast. It's called Freakonomics, and it's hosted by Stephen Dubner. And it has an episode that's all about licensure and why it's basically a racket. And some of the information in there will absolutely shock you. So if you're interested in knowing what's wrong with licensure and what the real barriers are to adding new licenses, particularly in healthcare, definitely check that out. Freakonomics, Stephen Dubner. I think it's called Is Professional Licensure a Racket or something like that. You can find it. Definitely worth a listen. Anyway, so I was saying in my response to this post that licensure should happen, but physicians would never allow it. I went on to say that beyond that, today's technologists are expected to work more hours, take more call, travel longer distances, and make less money. The average starting salary for a new college graduate in the U.S. is around $60,000 to $65,000. That's what I said on the YouTube thread, but I have to make a correction here. Actually, the average starting salary of a college graduate in 2025 is $68,700 in the US. But then we have to dive into a bit more specifics, right? So a bachelor's level neuroscience grad tends to make somewhere between 45 and 60,000, with room for upward adjustment based on specialization and employer, etc. New grads, I think we all know, often expect more money. So surveys report that expected salaries of this graduating class, they're expecting to make between 75 and 100,000 or more. And that is just based on surveys that come out of ZipRecruiter, right? But most graduates land around that 68,000 mark. So that's my correction. Continuing with my comments from the YouTube thread, I said, if you graduate from college and landed neurodiagnostics and you're making 45 to 55 and you're working 1.5 times longer hours than your peers and you're being treated like shit by hospital employees when you're just trying to blend in and do your job, why would you stay? So, you're not going to double the size of a workforce that feels marginalized. And if you look at the data, and this is part of what at Joe Hartman pointed out, there have been two major upticks in the number of annually expiring CNIMs. He pointed out the one around COVID, but the first one actually came in 2010. That was the year after neuromonitoring was deemed a practice of medicine. That could have contributed to that. And those rates of expired CNIMs, they ticked up and then they pretty much held steady for a while. And then came COVID and the numbers jumped again. But this uptick now is progressive. We're losing double the rate that we were before. Why is that? Well, I think some groups downsized their workforces during COVID and learned that they could basically accomplish the same work with fewer people, particularly as case volumes returned to near normal levels in Q4 of 2020. But we're also plagued with more problems with that. And there's really no easy solutions. But step one, I believe, is having some serious discussions about respect and licensure. Unfortunately, we have been attempting step one for well over 10 years with literally zero progress. Of course, we have, I think, a totally separate problem emerging over the next 10 years, which is that by 2035, there will be more people in the United States over the age of 65 than under the age of 18, which means that we are looking at a significant national workforce shortage in any service like neuromonitoring that deals with aging patients who, as a result of modern medicine, are living longer than any previous generation. Some people see uncertified and unqualified or underqualified or undertrained practitioners as a solution to fill this gap, where we have this unmet need that is expected to start around 2027. I do not. In fact, I'll take it a step further and say that I believe that it's unconscionable that in 2025, the CNIM is still not required. And if it is, it's required by individual hospitals. I mean, we talk about licensure, right? But why would any politician support the idea, support or sponsor a bill for licensure of neurodiagnostic technologists in their state if our profession can't even agree that the CNIM should be required? So in my mind, it's time for professional societies and certification boards to take a stand on this, because I just don't think, I don't think licensure is going to happen. I don't think anybody really ultimately is going to take certification seriously unless it's required by societies and by boards. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics. You can submit your questions and comments to the Rich Vogel subreddit or to Stimulating Stuff podcast at gmail.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to Stimulating Stuff on YouTube channel, and please take a moment to like and subscribe to this show on whichever platform you listen. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Rich Vogel, and that was Stimulating Stuff.